So now that we've talked about real exchange rate, we can move on to purchasing power parity. The whole idea with the purchasing power parity is this idea that the same amount of money that you have should have the same purchasing power in different countries. So it shouldn't be more expensive or cheaper to buy a MacBook computer in the States versus in Canada. It should be pretty much the same, or else if it's cheaper in the States, well, you'll have an incentive to go there. If it's much cheaper, if it's just a small difference, maybe not. And if it's cheaper here in Canada, well, then they'll have an incentive to come over here if they can. So different goods would typically have a real exchange rate equal to 1. Because in that case there, that same amount of money will buy the same amount of things in both countries. But naturally, this is not always the case. So you have this idea that if the price of the good is more expensive here than the price that is abroad adjusted for the exchange rate, there's an incentive to buy that good abroad. As that happens, as a lot of people buy, so let's say you could imagine those two markets, think about like mountain bikes in Canada or in the States. So here this is in Canada and this is in the USA. Well, if it's much more expensive here, so let's say for that same mountain bike here it's 4,000 Canadian, and adjusted for exchange rates it's 2,800 over there, and we're talking about the same thing. So naturally, as more and more people will go to the States to buy their bikes, what's going to happen? Well, there's going to be a drop in demand for the bikes here, so it's going to have a downward pressure on the price. And a lot more people will be buying the bikes there. They'll be selling off really fast, so there'll be an upward pressure on the price, potentially. So just this downward pressure on this price, upward pressure on this price, will eventually get closer to an equal price between the two. If this is a good that's really big part of GDP, such as some larger output goods in our country can be, not mountain bikes, well, in that situation, we could also have a situation that as more Canadians demand US dollars, they're essentially buying US dollars, making the US currency appreciate relative to the Canadian currency, or the Canadian currency is losing value. So as the Canadian currency is losing value, it becomes more expensive to buy an American good because those American dollars are more expensive. So all of those factors of this going down, that going up, and our currency depreciating are making us move to that direction of where this is equal, which is exactly the same as having the real exchange rate equal to 1. This whole process is, well, when mountain bikes maybe not called arbitrage, but arbitrage is the idea of making easy profits when you could buy something somewhere and sell it somewhere else right away, instantly, and make money off of it. So if you could buy a stock of a company on a stock exchange and sell it on another exchange at the same very instant, you're not taking on any risk because you're buying and selling at the same moment, and it has to be at the same moment. And in that case, if you're buying for cheaper than you're selling, you're making a riskless profit, and this whole process is arbitrage. But as you're doing that, the prices will adjust that this arbitrage opportunity disappears very fast. So it's that kind of general idea. So you could think this is one of the reasons why currencies may change in value, is when there's a big difference in the price of two different goods. It's going to create some of that to happen. The Economist, which is a really good newspaper, well, not newspaper, but magazine to look at, which is published every week. Every year they publish the Big Mac Index, and essentially they're trying to see, well, what's the price of the Big Mac in all of these countries, so it's always in their own currencies, and based on how much this Big Mac costs in the States, they have a predicted exchange rate, and this predicted exchange rate is based on the real exchange rate being equal to 1 or having absolute purchasing power parity, and then they compare it to the actual exchange rate. So we could see here that a predicted exchange rate is this, but this is our actual exchange rate. So it gives you an idea of if our actual exchange rate is overvalued or undervalued relative to what it should be if we had absolute purchasing power parity. Absolute purchasing power parity does not hold typically. It's not something that necessarily always happens. For some goods that are very heavily traded, it will happen. But otherwise, there is a tendency for these prices to adjust towards purchasing power parity or relative purchasing power parity. The big thing that stops absolute purchasing power parity from happening is just if you have non-traded goods. For sure, if you're thinking about like a massage in Canada versus in Thailand, and Thailand's gonna be a lot cheaper, but you can't just get a massage on the weekend in Thailand. You have to fly there and so on. So it's much harder. But if you think about goods that are easily traded across the border, you're going to have something closer to purchasing power parity, because people will not buy for more expensive when they could easily, if it's very easy and costs less to ship and there's no extra import fees, people will just import it and it's going to get close to that purchasing power parity or that real exchange rate of 1 for that specific article. So traded goods or length that it takes to get it shipped, or just import tariffs and stuff like that, block purchasing power parity from happening. So this is not the sole reason to explain the value of a currency. We've looked at very briefly before, but the idea of relative interest rates, so whether it's higher or lower, and that's what we'll talk about a little bit in this next section, this interest rate parity. But you could also think about like higher inflation rates in between different countries, what kind of influence that will have. There's a slide on that, a question on that. If you have higher inflation, well, if you think of that Germany example, or Germany, that was the example that was used, you could see that their currency has lost value a lot throughout that process. So there's different things that explain the value of a currency and how it changes. So we're going to move on to interest rate parity next.